Hi, I'm Tarun Khanna, professor at Harvard Business School, here to describe a paper I've jointly worked on with a collection of colleagues at Harvard, Crowdsourcing Long-Run Memories of Involuntary Forced Migration, a mixed method analysis of the 1947 Partition of British India. Now you'd ask, why should scholars of international business be interested in the forced migration of 15 million people 70 years ago? I have a one-word answer: institutions. The entire field of international business is arguably predicated on the study of institutional differences. For example, as IB scholars, we study arbitrage opportunities created by different institutions. We study how we can learn from differences in national endowments of all sorts, different cultures. So it behooves us to really try to understand the genesis of institutional differences. And of course, we do this in a routine manner. But I think one method that's underemphasized is to look for epochal events that have shaped institutional structures with which we're endowed today around the world. And there's nothing as epochal as a cataclysmic event that was visited upon the people of South Asia when decolonization occurred and the British withdrew and during the dismantling of the British Empire. That forced event, that trauma, continues to shape the life of 2 billion of the world's 7 billion people. I'll say it again, 2 out of the world's 7 billion people are affected by that event today. So it's clearly up there in terms of importance. What we're doing in this paper is really something unorthodox. I hope you'll agree it's creative. We are trying to quantitatively analyze the qualitative memories as recounted to us through a novel data collection technique, that's the crowdsourcing, by survivors who experienced this trauma 70 years ago. So there's a variety of points of novelty, and we welcome your critique and commentary on it. Now, migration itself is super important. I have only to remind you that we have the cataclysm of the Syrian refugee crisis, with Syrians coming out of their war-torn countries, spreading across the Middle East and into Southern Europe. We have the Rohingya crisis, which is traumatic, of people leaving Myanmar or Burma, depending on how you want to refer to it, and going into Bangladesh. And we are likely to have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of forced migrants, involuntary migrants due to climate change. So it really behooves us to understand this. I'm going to hand off to my colleague Shubhangi Badada, graduate of the Harvard Law School and colleague at the Mittal Institute at Harvard, to describe the analysis, and then I'll come back and conclude.
As Professor Khanna mentioned, the partition of British India is a pivotal event that took place 73 years ago and continues to shape South Asian politics and society. However, the last generation that experienced and survived partition are now rapidly disappearing. There is therefore an urgency to collect and analyze the long-run memories of this event. To gather the data, to begin our analysis, we developed what we call the ambassador model. The ambassador model mobilized more than 300 trained volunteers to interview survivors of partition living in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. A volunteer would use a semi-structured questionnaire to interview a survivor in their native language for an average of about 20 to 40 minutes. The volunteer would then translate and transcribe the interview into English. This method allowed us to collect a large number of narratives from across the region in a relatively short period of time. Since we used a modified snowball sampling method, we needed 2 to 3 times the responses of a purely random sampling to find statistically interpretable correlations. We were successfully able to gather and analyze 2,396 narratives from a diverse group of partition survivors across the 3 impacted countries, which has not been done before due to the political conflicts between these countries since their creation that hampers such cross-border research. Demographics. Women comprise 32% of our sample. Religious minorities, such as Muslims in India, Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan and Bangladesh, Christians and Parsis comprised 22%. 19% of our interviewees were from families who were poor or lower middle class just before the partition. The large majority of our sample were migrants. Almost 74% of interviewees stated that they moved across the newly established borders of India and Pakistan. From these interviews, a team of researchers manually coded each narrative based on a selection of variables. we analyze the resulting data using linear regressions. In the paper, we report broad findings, some of which provide statistical support to the existing knowledge about the experience, while others point at new findings. In the next few minutes, I will focus on two of our key contributions, which has been the analysis of the views that interviewees hold today regarding partition and the collection and analysis of the long-term memories of members of minority communities from the region. For our analysis, we define minority group as Hindus who remained in Pakistan and modern Bangladesh and Muslims who remained in India. Views of partition. One of the most interesting results we found was regarding the views our interviewees expressed. Those views were coded as positive, negative, or neutral. Expressed views of partition were significantly correlated with the location of the interviewee. Interviewees currently living in India had a more negative view of partition than those living in Pakistan or Bangladesh, despite the relatively slower progress of Pakistan over recent decades compared to India. Normally, economists and applied social scientists would say that if you've lost income and material goods and have lower socioeconomic status, you'd feel worse. But here, Pakistan has had a tougher past than India, yet they think of partition more positively. So these results indicate that there must be something more powerful that offsets their reaction, possibly a strong belief in nationhood or an ideology. Minorities. Historian E.H. Carr observed that the facts speak only when the historian calls on them. It is he who decides which facts to give the floor and in what order or context. This holds true for partition history as well. Our attempt in this paper has been to collect narratives from many groups who have often been underrepresented in past studies of the partition. Unsurprisingly, minorities as a whole had a worse experience of partition than the majority groups, whether it was violence or fall in socioeconomic status. Overall, minority groups stated that they felt more negatively about partition. Minority groups were on average 11% more likely to experience violence or the threat of violence than majority groups. The socioeconomic status of interviewees was manually coded based on varied factors such as occupation, land ownership, family wealth, class, belongings traveled with, mode of transportation, etc., that were mined from the responses of the interviewees. While the socioeconomic status of most interviewees worsened as a consequence of partition, minorities were more likely to see a fall in their socioeconomic status than members of the majority groups. They were also, on average, 42% less likely to have received government assistance than the majority.
Let me pick up from where Shubhangi left off and turn to some of the limitations of the analyses. Obviously, first and foremost, we're dealing with memories. Memories are not objective constructs, they are fickle constructs. If you and I go through a particular episode several decades after the fact, it's quite likely that my recollection will be different from yours. That said, it doesn't make memories any less important. They still form the basis of the mental models from which we extrapolate and determine our actions. So they're fundamentally important for scholars who are interested in individual agency and the way it's being acted out in the international arena in our case. Second, there are limitations of language. The oral data that we have are in multiple languages. In this particular analysis, we rely on English translations of those. Obviously, something is lost in translation. We have to be better using natural language processing techniques, which are ever improving at doing things in the original language. I believe we can get there. At the end of the day, though, we're excited that we've created one significant database of memories of one important epochal event, and we hope it sheds some light for scholars on how institutions emerge in an important setting. Thank you for your time.